All right, so my name is Annika. I'm a pitch deck designer and television writer, and I'm here to talk to you about the basics of pitch deck design for writers. I'm currently studying serial storytelling at the International Film School of Cologne. I'll graduate next year. I've freelanced with Citizen Skull Productions in Los Angeles and also for a lot of other clients in Hollywood. Um, and my real interests in television are fantasy and sci-fi, world building, and elevated genre. But really, I've designed decks for everything from documentaries about mountain climbing to animated children's TV to fantasy and sci-fi epics. So really everything. And there's my website in case you want to check out some of my other work, but we'll also go through a bit of that later. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, why pitch decks? Isn't my script enough to get an executive's interest? And I mean, in an ideal world, I think it would be. I think the script would speak for itself and stand for itself. Unfortunately, we live in a very fast-paced world, and not every executive has time to read your 100-page script or your 60-page script. So what we need in a pitch deck is something that gets your project's vibe across fast, effectively, and really just communicates in 5 or 10 minutes what it's all about. I don't think writers should have to be professional pitch deck designers to get their scripts read. I think it's an unfortunate part of the industry that so much depends on the visual selling materials, but I also think it's a good opportunity, even if you're not a professional, and not all of us are. I definitely didn't start out as one either, but to kind of leverage the easy, cheap design software out there to make a professional standard deck that will get your script noticed and hopefully communicate the most important things about it. So let's learn the basics, and there will be a Q&A later, so you can save your questions for that, and I will definitely look at them when we're done with the presentation. Our roadmap for this presentation, I will talk about the software options you have for designing pitch decks, the design basics, kind of the 101 of pitch deck design, writing your text for the pitch deck, which is also very important, sourcing the images, and then next steps, and at the end we'll have the Q&A. Here are the software options, kind of the big ones that are currently being used, and I do have strong opinions about them. You may have used them before or poked around some of them before. I am not ashamed to admit that I designed this presentation and many of my other presentations on Canva. It is very easy to use, but I would say hard to master. The thing about Canva is that it's so easy to use, but it can look cheap, and a professional graphic designer will often be able to look at a Canva poster or a Canva deck and be like, oh, that was made in Canva. I recognize the default font. I recognize the default template, or I recognize like a lot of the vectors and graphics that Canva offers for free. So the thing about Canva, if you're going to use Canva, you have to put effort into it to not use the defaults, to really individualize and customize it. So it's going to be something that looks a little more personal and a little more professional and polished. So you do want to dig in there and learn how to use it. The other thing with Canva is that you can pay for a subscription. I think it's $15 US a month. And then you'll have access to a lot more fonts and a lot more graphics. And I think that can be worth it, especially if you're making a pitch deck that you're going to download as a PDF and send around to people. If you want it to look that much better, you can pay the $15 for a month and then cancel your subscription. Do remember to cancel though, because they will charge you. Another option that I don't see used as much, but I personally used a lot with Citizen Skull Productions, is Adobe Express. The thing with Adobe Express is that you don't generate it as a PDF. It's more like a web page. So you have like a title at the top, and then you scroll, and then you maybe have an image, and then you scroll. So it's a scroll through, like you open it in Safari or Firefox or whatever browser you use, and you scroll through it like a web page. And it looks great. It looks very sophisticated and elegant, and you can scroll through the whole thing and have these beautiful slideshows. But because you can't generate it as a PDF, and a lot of people are like, hey, can you send me the PDF to your deck? It can sometimes be a little inconvenient. But if you are okay with just having a web link to your pitch deck, it is very easy to use and looks really good without a ton of effort. I'll also say there is a paid version of Adobe Express that gets you like more templates and more fonts and more customization, but I don't think it's super useful for the money. So I would probably stick to the free one unless you really, really want the added customization. The downside to Adobe Express, other than the no PDF thing, is that you don't have a lot of options about like where the text goes on the page. Like it pretty much decides for you where the text is going to be. So it looks professional, but only because it's like you don't have options. Finally, Adobe InDesign. It's kind of the professional standard for like magazine layout and the Duffer Brothers Montauk deck layout and newspaper layout and things like that. It's also subscription based and more expensive than Canva or Express. And I will say it's the hardest to use. If you're going to pay for Adobe InDesign, you'll probably also want to pay for a class to learn how to use Adobe InDesign. But if you do want to learn how the Duffers made their beautiful deck for Stranger Things, aka Montauk, with these images and with a text that looks like a real book, I mean, they definitely made that in InDesign. So, like, that's top of the line professional. But I think for most of our purposes, you will be okay in Canva or okay in Adobe Express. I was also entirely self taught. In college, I was part of the newspaper design staff, and when their lead designer quit, they promoted me after like a month of working there. So I pretty much was tossed into the deep end and had to learn Adobe InDesign and Photoshop and all those apps really quickly. You can do it too. It'll take some work to learn InDesign, but like if you want to learn it, you can. It'll just maybe take slightly longer and more of an investment than you want to do if you're a full-time professional in another field. So yeah, for this presentation, I'll mostly be talking about Canva because I'm going to assume we're all going to use Canva. Here are some design basics, kind of the cheap and dirty tricks that every designer should know. First, most importantly, is that you want high quality photos. The amount of times I've had a client email photos to me that are like itty bitty thumbnail size is unbelievable. They shouldn't be fuzzy, they shouldn't be pixelated, and they should not be like stretched or squished so they like look like they were, I don't know, edited in a really bad way. Um, Sometimes if clients send me an image and it's like teeny tiny thumbnail size, I can do a reverse Google image search and find a higher quality version of that image. But sometimes it just doesn't exist. In that case, I just have to find an alternate image and ask the client if it's okay if we just swap it out. It's fine, but like you can just start off and just have a much better day by finding high definition images to start with. Fonts should, above all, be readable. And as we learned from Ryan Gosling in Saturday Night Live, please don't use the papyrus font. Please don't use Comic Sans, and please don't use Copperplate, which is a personal pet peeve of mine. Like we've seen it a million times. There are so many free fonts out there. Canva gives you hundreds of free fonts right off the bat. And if you search free fonts on Google, you will find even more. Consistent and intentional spacing is everything in design. I think Canva does a lot of the work for you. It's very user-friendly, it's very intuitive, but you definitely don't want like letters that overlap or squish together, and you don't want them so stretched that you can't tell like which word a letter belongs to. And between images, you want the spacing to be consistent. As in a screenplay, you don't want ginormous blocks of text because the eye is going to skip right past it. You want to break it up, or ideally have a single shortish paragraph per slide and then move on to the next slide. Pitch decks are visual selling materials, so the emphasis ought to be mostly on the images, the aesthetic, the vibe, less so on the text. Of course, the text is important, it's supplemental, and it's going to work together, but you don't want the text to like drown out everything else. It should be as simple as possible. So in graphic design, a very important consideration is where is the viewer's eye drawn? Because you want your viewer to linger and actually read what's there, actually take it all in, you want to design something that draws the eye into the center of the slide. So that means you want the most like noticeable stuff to be pointed towards the center. That means shadows along the edges, like a vignette, are a really good tool. And if you have a character or a subject in your slide, you want the eye line pointing towards the middle, not towards the outside, because our eyes naturally follow the eye line of somebody who's on the screen. You also want to use shadows intentionally, and have it all, again, like hopefully gesturing and pointing towards the middle. Color schemes are important. You don't want there to be so many colors that it looks crazy, or, I mean, unless that's the vibe of your script. You want to really look at visual comps from the genre that you're writing in. If you have a rom-com, look up posters from as many rom-coms as you can. What design choices are being made here? What fonts are they using? You're going to have happy smiling people, and you're going to have color schemes in yellow, red, blue, white, like brighter colors that guide the viewer towards this genre, versus an action poster. And you should be collecting these posters that are going to be comps for your pitch deck and maybe your Pinterest board. What fonts are they using? Like, it's going to be like a gray, a blue, a metallic kind of color scheme. And you want to be able to use the right color scheme that communicates to the viewer what genre it is. Use the right font for what genre it is. So yeah, definitely look at as many comp posters as you can in order to kind of learn the visual language of whatever genre you're writing in. Contrast and readability is super important. You want to put dark colors on light backgrounds and light colors on dark backgrounds so you can immediately read it. If your colors are too close together, it's not going to be readable at all. Always check with a friend, like, hey, can you read this slide easily, or do I need to change the color on this? Because if an executive can skip reading something, they certainly will. So make it as easy for them to read as possible. Writing your text for the pitch deck is very important. It's not just visuals, it is also what you're saying about the visuals. And once again, simplicity is key. You want it to be not too long, but you want it to actually give the vibe and give and communicate the most essential things about your story. So you're going to start off with a title slide. It's just going to have the title, author's name, maybe your format, for instance, drama series or sci-fi series, or like in the Montauk deck, an epic tale of sci-fi horror. That's a good one. Next slide is going to be your log line. Keep it simple, just like picture, log line. Next couple slides are going to be a couple paragraphs about your story, potentially your comps, and then a slide per character. This section very quickly becomes hard for writers, because I know you know a lot about your characters, but you should not be writing massive walls of text about them. And especially for main characters, you should not be writing too much about their backstory. You want what makes them tick, what's their motivation, who are they, in 3 to 6 sentences. You don't want, she grew up in Ontario and her parents died. Like, if that's crucial, it's okay, but you want to get to the meat of it as fast as possible. Again, with supporting characters, if they're crucial to your story, you can have them in there. But I see so often that writers want to put in way more characters than are actually necessary for your pitch deck. So if you can fit 2 supporting characters into a single slide, or if you can just cut the supporting characters entirely, do that. You just want it to be as simple and clean to read as possible. And then a slide about your tone and style, probably, again, visuals heavy, just to get across this is the vibe, this is the aesthetic, this is what the show or the movie is. And then if you're writing a TV series, you want a couple of slides explaining your episodes, and then a slide or 2 about future seasons, kind of to prove this has a series engine, this can last for several seasons, and I have ideas for future seasons. Then you're going to have an author bio and headshot. If you are a writer, making pitch decks, I am begging you to get a professionally done headshot. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to pay hundreds of dollars for this. iPhones are pretty good these days. It just has to be a good professional photo of you. Put it on LinkedIn, put it in your pitch deck, have it look good, and have an author bio that is professional as well and says who you are, that connects even to your story and says, like, this is why I'm the right person to write this. That's also a good idea to have a slide like that in your pitch deck. And then finally, you want a thank you slide and your contact info. The idea of this pitch deck is that it, as quickly and effectively as possible, gets the idea of your story across. So you don't want it to be too long. You don't want it to be essentially like the series Bible, for your series that has all the information ever that is about your show. You want it to be shorter than that. So when in doubt, only if necessary does it go in the pitch deck. And it shouldn't be longer than, I'd say, 20 slides max. And even then is, I think, pushing it a little bit. 15 is better. Sourcing images. Okay, this is where I sound like an advertisement because I love ShotDeck so much. Unfortunately, they are not paying me, but they should. ShotDeck is an archive of high-quality images from films and shows, and it is subscription-based, but I do think it's worth it because I use it so much for just finding great photos. The best thing is that you can search ShotDeck by so many like in so many ways. You can have it interior or exterior shot, type of lighting, number of people in the shot, time period, or actor or director, or like so many ways to find whatever shot is in your mind. And it's such a huge archive. They're adding things every week, and you can also request things if you have a subscription. So if you request a movie or a series, they'll probably have it eventually for you. I am getting slightly ahead of myself, but ShotDeck is what I use, I'd say 80% of the time when I am sourcing images for pitch decks, and especially if you are like making more than one pitch deck, I think it's worth it to get a year-long subscription and support them because they're doing great work. I will also say I use Pinterest a lot, but I don't use it for finding images for the decks. I use it to make a mood board, and then I source the images somewhere else where they'll be better quality, and I can also find the accreditation for the image. Pinterest is unfortunately full of stolen images and very low quality images, but it is a great place, for instance, if I'm looking for like 100 rom-com posters to get the right vibe for a rom-com poster, then I'm going to collect all of them there and be able to scroll through it later. So it's great for the mood board and like visualization part of creating your pitch deck. And then there's free stock images. I have used Google Images and Pixabay and Unsplash before. The unfortunate thing about free stock images is that very frequently they will look like a stock photo and not look like a shot from a series or a film. So if you want it to look cinematic and you want it to look like it's from a series or a film, then you'll probably prefer ShotDeck. But once in a while, you'll find the needle in the haystack on these free stock photo sites, and it'll be really nice. I'm also someone who loves like fan casting actors and actresses for scripts. And this is super useful because a lot of the time my clients are like, I want an actor who's between 30 and 40, African American, like he's been in some movies, but not too many movies. He's like not Idris Elba, he's not an A-lister. Can you find me somebody like this? Or like 5 options for this character, and I can choose one to put in the deck. And that's probably my superpower, that I could immediately find people who fit that description. I would advise you against using A-listers in your pitch decks just because people are going to be like, you're not going to be able to get Idris Elba for your film. If you use like the B-list and C-list people, then it seems more realistic. But really, actors in pitch decks are more about the vibe and the type than it is about the specific person. So you can use kind of whoever you want, as long as the type is right for the character. You can also avoid using faces entirely and just have character descriptions over a background that doesn't have people in it, which is also an option. And here's my slight short and sweet rant against AI in pitch decks. I think there are many good reasons to not use AI-generated images in your pitch decks, but a very important one is that it's just going to look pretty unprofessional. Because if you want your pitch deck to look filmic and cinematic, AI really can't do that. What can do that is well-composed images from real films and real series that were composed by a real person who knows what a film or series should look like and make it look beautiful in an image. And I also think it shows that you have a knowledge of your comps, and you have a knowledge of like what you want your film and series to look like if you're pulling images from pre-existing films and series, because then you get to say, this is the look I want, this is the cinematic composition I'm thinking of in your pitch deck. The other thing is that there are a lot of executives who are very anti-AI, and they would probably immediately write off your pitch deck if they see AI-generated images in your deck. So better safe than sorry, and stick to real images that you can credit to real films and real directors of photography in your pitch decks, and I think everybody will be much happier for it. Okay, that's my AI spiel over, but I will definitely take questions about this if you have them. So that's also my advertisement for Shot Deck, but I do think it's very much worth it if you're making pitch decks and pulling images that are high definition, and so many ways to search images on Shot Deck. It's a really, really beautiful website, and yeah, I do think they should sponsor me. So next steps. So you're arranging your text and your images. I think it's a good thing that, like, once you have your text and your images, it becomes a bit of a puzzle to put together which image matches which part of your text. And you're going to end up spending time on this, switching them around. Maybe you thought one image was perfect for this paragraph, but you're going to switch it around later. It's going to take time to get it polished, but then very important that you have other people who can look at it and tell you if it's readable, if there are like mistakes that you missed, typos you missed on it, if it's like in some places, if the text is too long and you need to cut it up into 2 slides instead of 1. And it is a good idea, like if you do have an artist friend or a graphic designer friend, get them to look it over and tell you, like, does the design look professional enough? Do I need to focus a little bit more on finding a different font, changing my spacing around, changing the colors? And again, the more decks you make, the better you will get at this, because you're going to figure out like tips and tricks to Canva or whatever software you're using. You're going to learn like the different effects that you can put on text, and you're going to figure out like, how can I make this look as polished as possible? And I do have a recommendation for you. If you don't have a project you're making a deck for right now, choose a favorite book that you've read recently and make a deck for it. Obviously, you're not going to like show this to people or pitch it to people, but it'll be a really good exercise in sourcing images, creating pitch deck text, and putting it all together. That will really prepare you for putting together your own pitch decks in the future. And you can look for images from similar genres, and you can create text that you think sells the story really well, and it'll basically teach you how to use Canva and set you up well for whenever you have to make one for yourself. Very frequently when you export a Canva file, it's going to be like 20 megabytes. So if you can't email that, host it on Dropbox or something and send the link to people. Revise your deck as needed. Probably you're going to get notes on your script. That means you have to change things. Go back into the deck and remember to change it there as well, so the two actually line up. And revise it as needed. And again, like, practice. Use Canva. Figure out the things you can do on it, and figure out like what in design speaks to you, and then get better at it with practice. All right, here are a couple examples of work I've done just to show you like how I would build a cover for a deck. This one is for a dramedy short that doesn't exist. It's just a work sample. But obviously I wanted it to look very clean and modern, and also have like a font that to me looks like a Chinese font. So in GMA, you'll see I have a calligraphy font at top, and then the GMA text itself is a font that to me screams like, oh, I'd see that Chinese font in like a bus stop or an airport or something. That's just what the pinyin fonts, like with the tone markers, will look like. So the first step was to find an image on Shot Deck. And I love this image because you have the sun poking over her shoulder, and she's like, you can't see her face, but she's like trying to pick a direction, and that gets across the idea of the short film really well. I edited the colors here just in Canva to make the blue a little bluer, to have it be a little more vibrant. And then I chose the fonts, like I said, calligraphy, to get that idea across, a clash between tradition and modernity, and then dramedy short based on a story by Chu Ling. And then finally, I added that bit of shadow on the right just to draw the viewer's eye to the center again, like cheapest, dirtiest tactic by a graphic designer. Throw some shadow in the corner. It looks better instantly. And here's a dramedy series pitch deck I made a while ago. This is currently being pitched around, so I did have to change all the text here. But it's set in the Middle East, like a white woman travels to the Middle East. So the first thing I did was find an image that communicates that she's covered head to toe, luxury, clearly carrying a drink in a pool. And then to kind of communicate the idea of travel, I put it in a Polaroid frame with a shadow drop on the bottom to create the 3D effect. And then this pink crinkled paper in the background kind of communicates like an envelope or a letter or something, and I think matches the flamingo color really well. And then I chose my fonts. I spaced it out so it all looks balanced. And I added some shadow on the back of the title text. It's a small detail, but I think it makes it look fancier and stands out a little bit more. And so, like, you can see the spacing between the E in Lux and the edge of the screen is the same as the spacing between the left edge of the Polaroid and the screen. So you always want to make sure that that's symmetrical. Here's a not World War II, Civil War. Here's a Civil War era script about Walt Whitman. So we have a Civil War fight in the background and then the text in the front. And the client also wanted Walt Whitman in the forefront. So what I did first was find an image from a Civil War era film. I think it's probably Lincoln or something on shot deck. And then I edited the colors because we're not so much focused on this as we are on Whitman in the front. Found this photo of Whitman, and there's a very useful tool in Canva that cuts out the background. So you go from having this background here to just having this shape of the person here and adding in the text. And yeah, I think that looks nice. And I also used Lorem Ipsum text because I also can't share this text with you. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. That was almost exactly half an hour, and I hope we have time for questions. So any questions that you have about deck design, deck text, feel free to put in the chat, and I'll spend some time answering it. All right, Hayes Gray asked the primary difference in a lookbook and a pitch deck. Yes, the lookbooks that I've designed and made have almost zero text. They're going to be almost 100% visual. Of course, you'll have your title and maybe a log line, but the lookbook part of it is like, these are shots that I could actually see happening in my film. Composition, lighting, set design, color, those are the most important part of a lookbook and are like, I either want to exactly mimic this type of shot, or it is a type of shot that is very similar to what I'm planning for the film. Whereas a pitch deck, I would say it's more about the vibes. It's not specifically, I'm going to use this type of shot, but it's conjuring up an idea. Yeah, pitch decks are really more about like the idea than the specifics. And honestly, there are times in a pitch deck when I'm using things that I don't know if the client had specifically thought about or would even think about. Like, a lot of writers don't think about the shot composition for their potential films down the line. They're probably thinking more about story. But since pitch decks are visual plus the text, you want to create like a marriage of your text and your visuals, whereas lookbooks are more visual. Ray asked, what would I say the ratio of a pitch deck to pitching is? For example, you could have an amazing pitch deck, but the person selling the pitch is also important. Yeah, so I am in film school, and we have pitched at the Camp Festival in Cologne, Germany. So I have a little bit of experience in pitching to a live audience. And it is crucial that when you're pitching, your brand as a writer matches your pitch deck in a way. Like, it makes sense for this person to be pitching this type of story. And hopefully what the pitch deck does is reinforce that brand, and hopefully what your personal presentation does is reinforce the story you're telling in the pitch deck. You could have an amazing pitch deck and then an extremely boring person, but the ideal is that you're so enthusiastic about, or you fit the brand of the pitch deck so much that the audience like sees that and kind of like thinks of the two things as entwined. So you want the pitch deck to be as high quality as possible, and you also want to be the type of person that matches the idea you're selling in the pitch deck. And yes, it is a little dystopian to say that you as a person are a brand, but that is kind of what you're doing when you're selling yourself as a writer. So you want to be able to be the type of person who is selling the story and make sense to sell that story, if that makes sense. Buggins Will asked, how would you be able to highlight your USP or unique selling point without being too repetitive or cliche, especially in a competitive market? Oh, the million-dollar question, of course. So the unique selling point is something that's talked about a lot in selling a series or a film. Um, I guess the question at the base of that is, what is unique? I think it has to be personal in this day and age. It has to be something that only you can write, and it has to tie into something that you really care about. I think it is easy to be cliche because kind of the simpler you get when you're talking about a USP, the easier it is for that to become a cliche. The way to avoid cliche is to be as specific as possible to your personal experience. I can use myself as an example. I grew up in between the US, Germany, and China. So, very frequently when I'm pitching my ideas, I connect my characters' journeys crossing boundaries somehow to how I was crossing cultural boundaries, linguistic boundaries in my childhood, and now living in Germany as an adult. Um, and I think when you are talking about your USP, it pays to be as personal as you can. Sometimes that does mean revealing a sliver of your traumatic backstory to strangers, but it's all about what is compelling about yourself, what is stand out about yourself that other people can't say they did. It's your former career as a doctor or a veteran. It's your experience backpacking in Asia. Like it's something about you that not everybody can say they've done, that you can say you've done, that makes you the only person who can write the script or write the story. Ray, what are some search techniques you use when looking for images on Shot Deck? For example, should you search Victorian or movies that are similar? Um, so the really cool thing about Shot Deck is that you can search by time period. So you could search by 1800s, and then within that, you could search for images that are outdoors or indoors that have women or men in them. I don't think you can limit the time period by more than a century, but if you're in the 1800s, then you'll be able to like limit that based on other criteria and then probably find a ton of Victorian things. What I also will do is I'll limit it to the time period, and then within the thousands of search results that come up, I'll find specific movies that are set in the Victorian era, and then I'll go through everything from that specific movie and find a lot of things from that movie. And then if I have like 20 movies set in the Victorian era, you can find a plethora of images and create your deck based on those. Or I'll find like a costume designer and search via the costume designer. Fuffaloo asks, ever make a deck in German? Unfortunately not, because my German is not fluent. I am working on it because I would like to work in between the US and German industries in the future, but my German is unfortunately not good enough for me to be able to do that at that point. Maybe in a year or two. I'll keep you posted. Fuffaloo, is it better to lean into similarities to existing properties in your text and in your pitch, or would doing so be seen as unoriginal? I think it's a really good idea to lean into your comps, to a certain extent. When I'm writing pitch decks, I usually have 2 or 3 comps that I'll use both in the text, like, "This is a cross between, Bridgerton and Stranger Things." I don't know what that show would look like, but let's say let's say there is something like that. And then I will also use then images from Bridgerton and Stranger Things in the deck itself to reinforce those similarities. But it should not just be images from those 2 shows, because then like it'll just show that there's nothing new there. You want to pull from a lot of other inspirations and a lot of other shows and movies just to expand the idea a bit beyond your 2 comps or your 3 comps. I would say in general, if you're finding that you can build a whole deck with images just from a single series, your idea may be too similar to that series. So you want to expand it and have 5, 10, 15, 20 shows or films that you're pulling from in order to have like a richer visual language and a little more visual diversity. You still want there to be consistency, of course, and have like a bit of a color and aesthetic theme running through your pitch deck, but absolutely should not just be from 1 or 2 shows, otherwise it will just look like you're making a deck for that show or a deck for a fan fiction of that show. Would not having strong comps to create that common ground with your audience be a bad thing, or is having no direct comps fine if your pitch is otherwise strong? Oh, yeah, I've seen plenty of pitch decks without any direct comps, especially in Germany and the European market, comps are less common than in the US market. I will say that if you're working with an American production company, comps are almost like almost mandatory. Your manager or agent will almost certainly expect you to have your comps when you're writing out a pitch deck text. But I wouldn't say you have to have them if your pitch deck is otherwise strong. All right, I think we'll wrap up here unless anybody has a last minute question. And like I said, you can shoot me an email with any questions about pitch decks or anything else we've discussed tonight. I appreciate your patience again while we figured out the technical difficulties. And thank you, Script Hive, for having me. Um, I hope you can go forth and create beautiful pitch decks without papyrus in them. All right, with that, have a wonderful Saturday, and thank you again for coming.